particular type of government that Donald Trump runs, it's dangerous in the best of times, and it's been months since we are in anything even approaching the best of times. And so I wanted to check in with a guest we've had on a couple times before to see how Trump's movement, philosophically, ideologically, how it's constituted, how that is influencing the response to the pandemic and how members of his base are viewing the response to that pandemic. So I'm very happy to welcome to the show once again Jacob Urofsky, professor of philosophy at Yale University and author of How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Jason Stanley, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, John. Always great to be here.
Glad to have you here. We've talked about your book before. The updated paperback version is going to be available this coming week, just a couple of days after this video is made available. So congratulations on the softcover, first of all.
Thank you. I wish it weren't needed.
Yeah, that's 100% true. But we're not at that time yet. So let's talk about fascism. And we had Donald Trump and his movement presiding for a few years. Now we're in the middle of, the greatest domestic emergency that we've had in our lifetime. What are some of the thoughts that you've been having as you've watched the way Trump has responded to all of this?
So if you look at the international situation and with Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, with Vladimir Putin in Russia, and then you have Modi in India, all of whom are ethno-nationalists to some degree or other, all of whom have authoritarian tendencies, all of whom practice what I would call fascist politics. They're macho, strong men who trust their guts over science and reason and vilify their enemies as communists and socialists and demand just that the attention is fully on them and see themselves as infallible. Well, these are the countries with the worst responses to the pandemic. These are the countries whose leaders, and Trump foremost among them, or maybe Bolsonaro in Brazil foremost among them, have discarded the dictates of science, have declared themselves infallible, and are facing the worst of the coronavirus crisis because reality is not your enemy. It's just there. But in this kind of politics, there's only friend and enemy.
Yeah, there's already so many things I want to ask you. So this is what's confused me is I would sort of get if Donald Trump, who doesn't trust scientists or expertise of any kind, if he just felt that they were all wrong and thought it's not going to be that bad, then I sort of get how he could stupidly blunder into this horrendous response. But I wonder why didn't he have at least the forethought to realize that if he had been able to ward off the worst of the coronavirus, if he had actually been the protector of the American people that he presents himself as, it feels to me like he would have been a lock for re-election, that it would be in his own personal interest to do that, and yet he didn't. So why exactly? Is it just based on not trusting what the experts were saying?
Well, this mindset or ideology, and my work is not really about regimes. It's about the ideology or the mindset of someone who practices fascist politics. That ideology is reality resistant. It just says there are friends and there are enemies, and it denies anything. The person who practices this politics denies anything that they don't want to believe. So the pandemic posed a crisis. It posed a crisis, a difficult crisis, and it was hard to see that the crisis was going to involve a hit on one's popularity, a hit on one's favorability. So the mindset of this kind of leader is going to deny that it even exists, and then it's going to politicize the situation so that if you do think it exists, you too are an enemy.
Yeah. You've mentioned here, and we've talked in the last time we spoke about us versus them and how it's about dividing groups and things like that. Early on, Trump was he was pretty positive when he would speak about the government response to the pandemic. But even early on, before the death count started to really skyrocket, there was this attempt on the right, primarily on Fox News, to fight back by declaring that we have to call this the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus or whatever. It's not racist. We just think it's important that we point out who it is. And Trump has had a couple of very racially charged interactions with reporters who are either Asian American or he believes might be Asian. Exactly. Female. That's a very good point too. Universally female. Is that part of this? Is the need to maybe distract the American people by focusing on China? Should we expect more of that?
So this is a move that Trump is very good at making, to transfer something, to distract by raising the culture wars. So you might think that the use of the Chinese virus is the phrase "the Chinese virus" is a dog whistle, but I don't think it's a dog whistle. I think the politics works differently here. What he's doing is he's saying, okay, so the Chinese virus, that can mean different things. It's ambiguous, right? It can mean that China, the virus that came from China, although the Spanish flu came from, I think, the United States somewhere. But it could mean that the virus that came from China, the virus that was foisted on the world by China, the virus associated with Chinese people. It can mean any of those things. So what Trump is doing is he's seeking to provoke a culture war. It's intentional. It was intentional to distract us from the incompetence of his administration's response. He wanted to provoke people into calling him racist. Mm-hmm. So then he could say, look at the liberals. They're calling us racists again when I just meant this. And so so it changes the topics to the culture war. And that's one of President Trump's signature moves, to distract. When you've got an issue like the competence in a crisis, shift it to the culture wars, get the liberals to call you a racist, have plausible deniability. I just meant that the virus that came from China. And then your supporters are like, and then you say to your supporters, see, they're calling us racists again. Yeah. And then no one remembers your initial response.
Well, and my knee-jerk reaction would be to say, well, you can't deny the numbers. You can't deny 93,000 dead already, but it appears that some of them can deny those numbers and are going to increasingly gymnastic efforts to pretend that the numbers aren't serious or they're not as bad as you think. So the distraction, if you combine that with the fact that many of his base probably have a warped view of what the response was and what the cost has been so far, should we expect that completely bungling this thing might not be a huge danger to his reelection that you would otherwise assume, that if you have this emergency and you fail in your response to it, that people would throw you out of office? Is there less of a chance of that because of the ideological nature of his movement?
There's less of a chance of it. And it also depends on unpredictable facts about the near-term future. For example, the initial phases of the virus fit along patterns I discuss in the book, my book, How Fascism Works. So chapter 9 of that book is called Sodom and Gomorrah. It's about how fascist politics involves vilifying the cities, representing the cities as full of disease, filled with foreigners who bring disease. Trump has relentlessly used this to further his own ideological agenda of attacking cities as disease-ridden, of attacking immigrants. So very early on, they've consistently tried to link immigration, even legal immigration, to the disease, even though the United States is a place where has the worst problem anywhere in the world right now. So they've consistently used it to further that very ideological agenda. So the more that he can link the coronavirus and disease, which in the fascist imaginary is linked to foreigners anyway, the more he can link that to immigrants, the more it fits into this ideological framework, the more he can link it to Black and Hispanic residents in the United States, citizens and residents who are in any case suffering more because they are the essential workers. Yeah. The more he can do that, the more it fits into the ideological framework of the kind of fascist politics he wants to run. And I think he's done a very successful job of convincing many of his supporters that it's a disease that poses less of a risk for them and more of a risk for urban dwellers, minorities, and immigrants. And let's not forget that. So the near future, if the disease makes significant inroads into his base, then we might see an effect in terms of his support. I suspect that will happen. But I think ideology can take you quite far. And so, so far he's been milking it to say, look, I said close the borders. Look, I said disease. And when you think disease, don't you think minorities? Because that's what he's trying to do. This kind of politics involves making that kind of fallacious link.
There's one other thing I want to ask you about, and I'm sure that it is, as we talked about earlier, it is being used as a bit of a digression. It's used as a bit of a distraction. But the whole thing about the masks, the fact that Donald Trump refuses to wear one, doesn't want to be photographed in one, and that has now become, for his movement, sort of one of the cores of their identity, is that they don't have to wear a mask. Some will say it's because it makes them look weak. Some will say that it causes CO2 poisoning or something. They're going to great lengths to justify not wearing it. When you talk about the macho nature of these fascist leaders, were you surprised that he would refuse to do the bare minimum to not be exposed to potentially fatal illness?
Not at all, because this is par for the course, as you point out. Jair Bolsonaro on March 24th, it gave a speech in Brazil where he said, Italy is an old nation, an aging nation. We in Brazil are a strong, young nation. And since I was an athlete, this will just be a small cold to me. So, and obviously Brazil is now, their healthcare system is completely overwhelmed. Their hospitals are not taking ICU patients anymore. This is par for the course. It's hard to see it's hard to see many of these leaders who base themselves in this macho, infallible image, and that is the mark of a fascist leader, that you're infallible. That's why reality is such a threat. So they're going to present themselves as infallible.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it could cost a lot of people their lives, because if your movement is going to be saying we need to get back out there as soon as possible, but then you link that with, and also we need to consider even the most minimal protective equipment an affront to our constitutional rights, that seems like a deadly mix. But finally, I wanted to ask you, I know that we mentioned that the new edition of your book, the softcover, is coming out. I know that you have a new preface. Could you tell us a little bit about that, about who wrote it and what it covers?
I wrote it, and it covers what has happened since the publication of the book in September 2018, and I wrote it in 2017. And now, how much we can look at what's happened to see that whether the frame of the book, in terms of fascist politics and rhetoric, how much that has predicted the subsequent events. Mm-hmm. So I talk about the pandemic. I talk about the science denial that is part of this politics. I talk about the attack on journalists worldwide, the attack on the press that is happening in India, in Brazil, in the United States, the way that Trump has unleashed authoritarians everywhere by not pressing for things like rights. And I talk about the attack on our own rule of law, how the Republican Party has increasingly become a loyalist party, the party of one singular figure, and how we don't even, how our norms of what is acceptable for politicians have just shifted by the minute. Yeah. And all of this was predictable.
Yeah, I'm sure he's probably, since the original publication of the book, I'm sure he's given you enough material for a full other book. But everybody, the book is How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Softcover will be available just a few days after this video comes out. And Jason Stanley, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, John.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.